Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon at the Rudman Center here at UNH School of Law. It's really a pleasure to have you with us, and it's a great honor for us to be joined by the panelists today who will be sharing some important insights about fiscal responsibility in the upcoming federal legislative process. And it's really a particularly appropriate event to host here at the Rudman Center, given the mission of the center and the center's namesake. The mission of the center is to inspire young people to consider careers in public service, work for the common good, be positively engaged in their communities. And the namesake of the center, Senator Warren Rudman, completely embodied that mission, and he inspires everything that we do here. And being joined by four public servants, really prominent public servants from our state, to speak about an issue that was of particular interest to the senator makes this event really especially appropriate to host here at the Rudman Center. As I'm sure most of you know, fiscal responsibility was an issue of enduring concern for the senator. He worked tirelessly to promote what he understood to be really appropriate federal budgetary processes and approaches. And after he retired, he co-founded the Concord Coalition, our co-sponsor of the event today, to continue the conversation about fiscal responsibility. And we're really lucky to have the Concord Coalition as a partner in much of what we do here at the Rudman Center, and events such as the one today in particular. The thing I would also want to note, I guess at the outset, given who we are and what we do and the person who's really inspired our work here at the center, is the significance of civil discourse, engaged in civil discourse about really difficult questions that our nation faces, over which we have profound disagreements. Federal budgeting is at the center of that dynamic. You won't find, I'm confident, uniformity of views among the people in the panel here. But what you will find is respectful, engaged, civil discourse about a critical issue. It's something that's a hallmark of our state, something that we take seriously and take great pride in. And obviously, I think most of the folks with us today, regardless of what your views may be, would share the view that our nation is in great need of more of that. And hopefully, the conversation we'll see today will be one of many going forward that can model the kinds of conversations that we're going to need to have as a country going forward to address the really extraordinary challenges that we face. I want to acknowledge at the outset the Concord Coalition folks who really pulled this together, starting with Bob Bixby, the executive director of the Concord Coalition, and Chase Hageman. Where's Chase? Chase in the back, who we're particularly proud of because he's a graduate of this law school, and he's the Coalition's New England Regional Director. So thanks to both of you for your great work. I also want to acknowledge a few special guests with us today, starting with members of the Rudman family. The Rudman family has been so supportive of the law school as we've launched this effort, really tirelessly supporting us from the outset, beginning with the Senator's wife, Margaret Rudman, who's with us here today. Margaret, thanks so much for joining us. Margaret comes up all the time from Washington for our events, just to be present and supportive of what we're doing. And we promise, Margaret, to try to coordinate these events better so you don't run up so much on your credit card for flights back and forth from D.C. Excuse me?
I can stay longer.
So you can stay longer, right. We're also joined by Senator Rudman's sister, Jean Gale, his nephew, and his nephew, Jay Gale. Jean and Jay, want to acknowledge you and thank you for joining us today. And then finally, I'd like to acknowledge some members of the Rudman Board of Advisors who are with us today. It's a really important group that helps us shape the agenda of the center and support its progress. We have the co-chair of the Board of Advisors, Ned Helms, with us. Ned, thanks for being here. We have Brad Cook with us, who's also the chair of the Rudman Center campaign, which is obviously pretty important to what we do. So thanks for joining us, Brad, and for all that you do to support us. Rob Werner, a member of the Board of Advisors also, supporter of the center. Thanks for joining us, Rob. Great to have you with us. I don't think I missed anyone. I think that's everyone. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce to you two of the products or the embodiment of what we're trying to do here at the center, two Rudman Fellows who are students who are studying here at the law school with fully supported scholarships as part of their status as Rudman Fellows. These are individuals who came to the law school with a deep expressed interest in public service, who are exploring in a very serious way how to involve themselves in their communities over the course of their professional lives and to make public service an integral part of what they do as lawyers. So we're really proud of both of them. They really, as I say, exemplify and embody what we're trying to accomplish here. And they will be introducing our speakers today. So I'd like to introduce Stephanie Ramirez and Nick Higgins.
Good afternoon and welcome. Nick and I have the pleasure of introducing our panelists and our moderator today. Taking over the podium for me in just a moment will be our moderator, Mr. Bob Bixby. Bob Bixby is the executive director of the Concord Coalition, a nonpartisan organization that encourages fiscal responsibility in Washington. Mr. Bixby is a graduate of American University, George Mason University School of Law, and the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He joined the Concord Coalition in 1992 and has served in several positions, including policy director and national field director. He frequently speaks around the country on nation's fiscal challenges and possible bipartisan solutions to those challenges. Second from your left today on our panel is Paul Hodes. Paul Hodes is a former Democratic member of the House for New Hampshire's 2nd Congressional District, serving from 2007 to 2011. Congressman Hodes is a graduate of Dartmouth College and Boston College Law School. While in Congress, he served on the House committees on financial services and on government reform and oversight. Congressman Hodes currently serves as an attorney, musician, president of a not-for-profit political advocacy organization, and as a consultant to businesses and not-for-profit institutions. Second from your right is Congressman William Zeliff. Congressman Zeliff is a former Republican member of the House for New Hampshire's 1st Congressional District, serving from 1990 to 1997. While in Congress, he served on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee as Deputy Whip and as chairman of the Subcommittee on National Security, International Affairs, and Criminal Justice under the Government Reform Committee. Congressman Zeliff is a graduate of the University of Connecticut. He also authored the A to Z budget cutting tool to encourage fiscal responsibility. Congressman Zeliff is currently a senior counselor at the Livingston Group in Washington.
Thanks, Stephanie, and good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to first introduce Ambassador George Bruno, who's sitting at the far end of our panel. Ambassador Bruno practices immigration law from his office in Manchester. He graduated from Hartwick College, and he went on to law school at George Washington University. He was granted a Reginald Herbert Smith Fellowship from the University of Pennsylvania School of Law, where he studied community development and anti-poverty law in Newark, New Jersey. His first client was a cab driver whose arrest sparked the Newark civil disturbances in 1967. From 1971 to 1976, Ambassador Bruno, who was then Attorney Bruno, was Director of New Hampshire Legal Assistance, and at the same time created and managed the New Hampshire Public Defender Program. In 1994, President Clinton chose him as U.S. Ambassador to Belize. He served in that capacity for 3 years. Today, his immigration law practice represents employers, students, schools, families, and families seeking visas, diplomatic intervention with embassies, work authorization, political asylum, and relief from deportation. And then finally, on the near end of our table here is Congressman Charles Bass. Congressman Bass attended Dartmouth College. He also served as a member of the United States House of Representatives for New Hampshire's 2nd Congressional District from 1995 to 2007, and again from 2011 to 2013. During his 14-year tenure in Congress, he served on numerous committees, including budget, government reform and oversight, transportation and infrastructure, intelligence, and energy and and the Energy and Commerce Committee. As a longtime member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, Congressman Bass has extensive experience with public policy in areas such as energy, telecommunications, healthcare, environmental protection, consumer protection, privacy, data security issues. In addition to his service in the United States Congress, he served 4 years in the New Hampshire Senate and 6 years in the state as a state representative. He now serves as a senior director at the Greenberg Traurig law firm in Washington, D.C., where he's a member of the firm's government, law, and policy group, focusing his practice on government policy and legislative matters throughout the federal government. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for coming. As you probably know by now, since I've been introduced 2 or 3 times, I'm Bob Bixby, Executive Director of the Concord Coalition, and it's always wonderful to be at the Rudman Center. Warren Rudman, of course, was one of our co-founders, and a man that I always enjoyed dealing with, and boy, do I wish I could pick up the phone and call him now to get some guidance and reaction to the last election, particularly about the fiscal policy coming up. Of course, Paul Tsongas was our co-founder, and to put this discussion today in a little bit of context, we're soon to be in 2017, and that will be the 25th year anniversary of the Concord Coalition. We're not sure whether that is a cause for celebration or not, because Paul Tsongas always said that our goal should be to put ourselves out of business. And that would be to declare that we had a sustainable fiscal policy, and there would not be a need for a Concord Coalition to talk about fiscal challenges and potential solutions on a bipartisan basis. Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, it looks like the Concord Coalition's mission is still going to be good for a while. And so we're going to talk about some of those issues today. I'm going to set up this discussion and our distinguished guest by setting out the challenge, and then they can tell us what to do about it. But there are obviously some substantive challenges. There are some political challenges. They've dealt with both. But it's important to recognize where we are with the federal budget and why this is kind of an important inflection point. When the Concord Coalition was established in 1992, we warned about the future impact on the budget of an aging population and health care and the way the budget is structured between mandatory spending versus discretionary spending. Well, now the future that we warned about has arrived. So the future is here, the future has arrived, and that has certain repercussions for the budget. So the current fiscal policy of the United States is unsustainable, which simply means that if you just left everything on autopilot, the spending programs, the revenues as they are, it would lead to larger and larger deficits with larger and larger interest costs on the rising debt, and eventually it just metastasizes to the point where nobody would lend us the money. So this is not a prediction of what's going to happen. It's not preaching gloom and doom. It's just saying this is a problem. We can't stay on the current course. But you can see that the debt as a percentage of the economy is already pretty high, higher than it's been since around 1950 when it was coming down from the heights of World War II. Just to look at the immediate path, the immediate projection for the budget deficit, the annual shortfall that the government faces, this is what the new president and the new Congress will. This is the baseline of what they have been elected to deal with. Congratulations. This is now your problem. But budget deficits are projected to continue to increase every year, reaching about $1 trillion again by the time the new president finishes up his first term or a new president is elected after that. And it's very important to just remember that these deficits, why, it's a good thing to ask, why are deficits projected to increase? I mean, why wouldn't they just stay the same? I'll get to that in a second. This is another way of showing the same thing. Instead of in dollar terms, this is showing a more relevant picture, which is deficits as a percentage of the economy, which again shows you that as our federal budget, we tend to spend at about 20% of GDP and tax at about 17% of GDP. And if the economy is growing at about 3% of GDP, that difference means that you can probably run a stable debt situation under that scenario. But as you can see from the projections, spending is projected to rise faster than revenues, and so the difference between the two will grow, deficits will pile up, and debt will pile up. Why is that projected to happen? It's basically because of two factors: aging of the population and healthcare costs. So when you look at individual components of the federal budget, it's the healthcare programs and Social Security that are projected to continue to grow more rapidly than the economy. The other programs are actually projected to grow slower than the economy. That would include defense and all the non-defense investments that the government might make in infrastructure and in healthcare. And then you can see the big red bar there, which means that if you continue to run budget deficits, eventually it's interest on the debt, which consumes all else and becomes the biggest growing factor in the budget. Again, I mentioned, why is that happening? Well, it's not like an accumulation of waste, fraud, and abuse, or Congress spending like drunken sailors. There's certainly some of those factors, but it's basically aging and healthcare costs that are driving that dynamic. So again, that's where we're headed on autopilot. It'll be up to the new president and the new Congress to try to do something to see what they can do to make sure that this situation doesn't come about. And so we'll now, I'll pose some questions to our three panelists. Our four panelists, I'm sure. I can't count too well, you see, and that's a bad thing for somebody that runs a fiscal. I'm getting some of that Washington disease, but that's right. Okay, so I think we should just get right to it and sort of run down the table here. I mean, you've got the new president and the new Congress. You look at the fiscal challenges and the political challenges. So, Charlie, you want to kick us off, or what advice would you give for the incoming folks?
First of all, Bob, thanks for inviting me, and Margaret, thank you for being here. That's a wonderful thing. Warren Rudman, Senator Rudman, was a great mentor for me, and it's an honor to see you here today. I also want to pay special tribute to my colleague to my left.
Excuse me.
My colleague to the left here, Paul Hodes, who gave me the opportunity to reflect for 4 years on what it was like to be a congressman. But then gave me the opportunity to return. And in that period of reflection, I had an opportunity to think about the situation in the United States in the context of intractable problems that are difficult to solve, that the framers of our system could never have anticipated. And one of the prime ones is obviously spending and the debt. They never envisioned the government being as centralized and as large and having the taxing ability that it has today. And that really didn't happen in America until after World War I. I think that the rise of massive deficits, quite frankly, which began to get out of control in the 1980s under the presidency of Ronald Reagan, has created entities like the Concord Coalition. And the Concord Coalition was around during my entire career in Congress, having seminars and doing models as to how you cut the deficit and bringing to the attention of the American people just how difficult this is. But the bottom line, which was alluded to here today by Bob, is that if we do nothing, we will be in terrible shape at some point in the future. The average American person heard that message 20 years ago and expected inflation and economic ruin and so forth, and nothing has happened. And so the reason why there aren't 1,000 people marching up and down the streets of Concord trying to figure out how we can balance a budget is because the only advocacy group for balancing the budget that really cares are people that either don't vote or haven't even been born yet. And so we as policymakers and past policymakers need to communicate that this issue is no less important today than it was 20 or 30 years ago. Deficits are not partisan. The reality is that the Democratic Party, when it was in control of Congress, initiated every single deficit control measure that we have in place today. The unholy alliance, however, that has arisen over the last 20 years is the Republicans' propensity to want to cut taxes and the Democrats' propensity to want to fully fund programs. And the two of them get together and they agree, and then you have high spending and no revenue increases to cover it. My last term in Congress, I voted for an alternative budget called the Bowles-Simpson budget, which increased taxes and reduced spending and brought the budget into deficit in a reasonable period of time. We got 37 votes on the floor of the House. And a lot of people on both sides of the aisle who had promised to be with us said, well, you know, this isn't a real vote, we are not going to bother. So you have to turn the discussion into some concrete proposals that can be enacted by the Congress, and we'll get into that later. And I do believe that there is an opportunity potentially to do that in the next Congress. I'll yield to my friend, whom I've had a number of occasions to stand on the dais with, but not always as friendly as this.
Well, everybody hear me okay? It's good to be here. Margaret, thank you for being here. Dean Budd, thank you for having us. We're meeting at a very interesting time, and certainly the number of people in the room here to talk about debts and deficits, the least sexy political issue in our political universe, is an indicator that people are concerned about the state of our politics and our government, if not debts and deficits. You know, it's a two-party problem. When I was in Congress, I cheekily proposed to the leadership that I said, look, if you really want to make some political hay and keep this historic majority, which was a 4-year Democratic majority in a 22-year landscape of Republican control of the U.S. House, I said, take some real measures to cut the federal budget and attack deficits. They looked at me like I was the two-headed Hydra monster. They thought it was just, that's crazy talk. I mean, that's crazy talk. We've got a lot to do. I think that there's a very interesting opportunity right now in the political framework. I can't tell you the number of people who have, they're not scratching their heads, they're scared to death about what's happened, whether Republican or Democrats. People are very, very anxious with the presumptive president-elect and what he's been doing and what he's been proposing, and we now have a one-party control of everything in Washington, D.C., but there's a very interesting opportunity, and the opportunity is that the policies proposed by the presumptive president-elect, a tax cut which would seriously advantage the top 1% and add approximately $7.3 trillion over 10 years to 21 or 22 trillion by 2036, a repeal of the Affordable Care Act, which would once again allow healthcare costs and the curve, which has been bending downward, to rise again at an unprecedented rate once the insurance companies reassert control, doing nothing about climate change, where we've already the economic impact has already recently been calculated at $500 billion, projected to go up in terms of both national security costs and weather-related and disaster costs, not to mention Social Security and Medicare. So and then combine, by the way, that tax cut with a similar size number for proposed infrastructure spending, which Democrats like. I mean, everybody likes to spend money on infrastructure. I mean, obviously, it's a completely crazy prescription for the United States of America in economic terms. The opportunity is that with the party, the Republican Party in control of the House and Senate, the opportunity is to reach those folks in Congress who would like to wear the mantle of fiscal responsibility. I mean, I spoke to Warren Rudman on a number of occasions. We talked about these issues. Fiscal responsibility was and for many Republicans of conscience, still is, the mantle that is worn. I mean, my colleagues who are here on this panel with me share, they wear that mantle very proudly. The opportunity, I think, is for citizens, for you all to be engaged, if you want something to do about it, and reaching out to the legislative bodies to say, you've got to do something about these crazy proposals. You've got the power to exert fiscal responsibility and do the right thing, because there are lots of folks in Congress who are not going to go along with what the presumptive president-elect would propose. So the opportunity really is for citizen engagement at this point to use fiscal responsibility as the wedge to reach people who may not be in your party, but who hopefully will care about the future for their children as we do. Bill?
Okay. First, Margaret, thank you for being here and your leadership. Warren was a mentor for me. Once a month, we would meet in the Senate dining room, and he would keep track of what was going on. First thing he got me on to was joining the Concord Coalition. We need that kind of leadership more than ever, and we don't have it. And what's happening is the mandatory pieces of our budget are absorbing and sucking up all the resources, and we keep promising more and more. And it's just like in our homes. If you spend more than you take in, you're going to be in serious trouble, and we are in serious trouble. And the sad thing is all of you young people out there is we're giving you a raw deal, and you're not going to have the same advantages that we have unless we turn this thing around. Now, can it be turned around? And I believe it can. For example, I'll just throw out one idea. Eliminate all tax code entitlements. This would eliminate $1.4 trillion from the tax code entitlements. With this alone, we would eliminate our annual deficit, and we could start paying down our debt. That's one idea. Simpson Bowles, if you want to really take a look at a great plan, they've done a tremendous job. And it would have been nice after they finished it that they were given an opportunity to implement it, because there's a lot of good ideas. And for example, one idea would be on real estate. For those of you that have 3 or 4 houses, you deduct all the interest for all your houses. No limitations. Well, how would you feel if we just said you can only do one house, your primary house, and you can't do more than $500,000? A lot of people will be complaining, but we have to. We've done some, I think you would agree, when we did our town meeting, and Dick Sweat and I, we had 80 people in Manchester, and at the end, we had the mic, and we went up in the aisle, and we said, okay, Paul, what would you give up? Oh, man, I'm not going to give up my Social Security. I'm not going to do this.
I wasn't there.
Yeah. I'm just having fun with it.
I know.
But at any rate, we've got to get real. We have a chance, but if we let it go much more, the debt will be unsustainable. And like at the bank's going to say, hey, I like you a lot, but you can't have any more money. And the interest rates start to go up, maybe in December, and then you're going to see our increased expenses. And so I'm a Republican. I'm watching what our new president is saying. I just hope he has ways of paying for what they're doing. And I think hopefully there will be enough people around that'll make sure that there has to be a balance. We cannot do new programs without finding out who's going to pay for them. In the 1990s, we did something that really took off, and I'm going to try to see if we can come back to it. I'm going to read just a few pieces of it. It's called A to Z. And A was Rob Andrews from New Jersey, a Democrat. I was a Z. And we actually, it was our creation of Marshall Cobley, who was my chief of staff at the time. It's called the A to Z budget cutting tool. The idea was very simple. Call a special session of Congress to focus on all aspects of the federal budget, determine cost-saving measures to ensure a sustainable budget. By focusing on specific cuts and giving each one a floor vote, the plan gave members a maximum of budget trimming flexibility. The A to Z budget cutting tool was more than just a simple talking point, but was a specific and clear-cut plan. So a special session of Congress should be convened for a minimum of 56 hours to debate spending cuts throughout the federal budget. Only amendments that reduce outlays would be allowed, no tax increases. Every program, including entitlements, would be subject to reduction. Entitlements are killing us, and we have Social Security is out of control in 1934, I believe, will basically be broke.
2034.
I thought it was 34.
2034.
Right year, wrong century.
Bill, you said 1934.
Sorry about that. So, no gimmicks, no backroom deals, no cosmetic cuts. An open process for the American people to watch and chance to remove wasteful programs. What happens is for every need, there's probably 6 different programs to address that need. We can go through the process, pick the best one, and knock out the rest. One of the most essential aspects of the program would be for the debate to proceed without restriction. And so basically we would have to have the whole, we had 205 people in the Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, committed to this, but the leadership whacked us down. And we had the discharge promotion. We got it brought back to 205 votes, but they basically didn't want this to happen. So there is an idea, I think, that we ought to all take a look at. And the other thing is we ought to take another read of the Simpson-Bowles Commission. And if any of you are interested in the budget, you ought to take a look at that as well. And so the bottom line is, we're sitting around in our living rooms, we want to spend money, and we have no money.
That's it?
That's it.
We have no money? Hi, I'm George Bruno, and let me begin my remarks by a bit of good news. 2008, the unemployment rate in the United States was 9%, and today it's 4.6%, under 5%, which many economists consider to be full employment. So that's a bit of good news, along with New Hampshire's unemployment rate of under 3%, something like 2.6, 2.7. So whatever our political leaders do, their first course of action should be to do no harm and to keep those unemployment rates, keep them down. The other thing I'd like to begin with is to say I'm not a member of Congress, and I've never been a member of Congress, and so I take no responsibility for the mess that we're in.
So you're blaming the three of us, right?
Well, you know.
It's all our
Right.
And then also, let me say, Ms. Rudman, thank you for being here. You and I have not met before today, I don't believe, but I had many dealings with Warren over the years, particularly when he was Attorney General and when my office sued the state quite a bit as New Hampshire legal assistant. And then later in Congress, when he was a member of the Senate, he became a great advocate for the cause of legal assistance and the Legal Services Corporation and providing legal services to the poor, which I think is one of his signature achievements in Congress, and for that we should be very grateful. In my mind, when we talk about the state of the U.S. economy and the deficits, there are at least three areas that require, I think, our special attention. The first being healthcare, of course. 1991, healthcare costs accounted for approximately 13% of GNP. In 2014, it's now up to 17%, and it wouldn't surprise me if it's now 20% of GNP. But as the new president talks about repealing and replacing the Affordable Care Act, I mean, we have to wonder what shape that's going to take and what is going to happen to the 40,000 people in New Hampshire, for example, who are under Medicaid extension and the 20 million who are on the Affordable Care Act now. And I think one of the things that the United States hasn't done very well is perhaps look at some of the way other countries around the world deliver health care. And some of them do it quite successfully, and some of them could offer some lessons to the United States. One of the other drivers of our economy, of course, is the spending. And President Obama, over recent years, has proposed a $500 billion package to do infrastructure spending in the United States. Hillary Clinton, during the recent campaign, proposed a package of $750 billion. Donald Trump is now talking about a $1 trillion package. And where all that money comes from is anybody's guess. But that leads me to sort of the third piece of as an economic driver in our country, which is taxes and tax reform. If we're going to spend $1 trillion or more on infrastructure spending, how are we going to handle this if we're talking about tax cuts of the magnitude that Paul alluded to? It certainly is not a very sustainable formula to increase spending by such enormous amounts and not have a plan to pay for it all. Let me throw in sort of an economic kicker here, and that is the whole aspect of immigration. And immigration reform, ladies and gentlemen, in case it's not well known yet, is more than just building a wall. A wall that, by the way, is 700 miles already completed. and a wall that would extend 1,900 miles across our southern border, and when completed would cost $25 billion. And we have to ask ourselves, is this a priority for our country? Is this the way we should spend $25 billion? Perhaps not. This week, the New Hampshire High-Tech Council issued a statement. There are 3,000 high-tech positions in New Hampshire that are unfilled. And I have to believe that part of the reason it's unfilled is because of our immigration system that doesn't allow talent that can't be found in our own country to come in and fill those holes. And remember, the absence of those 3,000 positions being filled cuts into the economic growth and prosperity of our state. And what are we going to do? Are we going to deport all 11 million undocumented aliens living in the United States? I think it's important to know that as the President-elect talks about building up a deportation force, that 8 out of the 11 million undocumented persons are part of the workforce in this country. And if you start fooling around deporting the 8 billion members of our workforce, what effect is that going to have on our economy? And I have to tell you that I don't think it's going to be a good effect. So why don't I leave it right there and open it up to our next segment.
Okay. I want to, you raised one question that's probably going to come up very early and which is important in all of this, which is the future of the Affordable Care Act, so-called Obamacare. We're going to have a vote probably in the next couple of months on repeal. And the debate in Washington right now is what constitutes repeal and replace. Do you do it all at once, or do you do something that is repeal now and replace sometime over the next 3 years, which is the strategy being talked about in the Senate Republicans? So I wanted to get your impression on that. And let's accept that with George and Paul would probably say, well, don't repeal, just fix what might be there. But the Republicans are probably going to go ahead with a repeal, and that was what the president-elect promised during the campaign. So I'm curious about this. Should you try to do repeal and replace all in one package so people know what's coming, or is it that's too much to do, so let's do repeal first and then replace sometime over 3 years? Charlie, do you want to?
Well, first of all, Bob, you can list 18 different issues in the next hour that will be up before the U.S. Congress and the Senate, and whether or not they're...
Use the mic.
Yeah, sorry. And whether or not they're... is that louder? And whether or not we should do it this way or that way or the other. But what we're really here to discuss today are systemic changes that can be made to the system rather than the policy votes themselves. We can argue about whether there should be a wall between here and Mexico, or whether or not we should be spending $1 trillion on infrastructure, whether or not we should be cutting taxes. Ultimately, by the way, in all of those discussions, the Congressional Budget Office will score all this stuff, and it'll put the Republicans in a difficult spot because they are not going to want to substantially increase the deficit. And they're not going to, and the CBO is not going to accept what's known as dynamic scoring, which is in essence a tool that says that the more you cut taxes, the more revenue comes in because you bolster economic growth. I would rather suggest that the issues of health care, immigration, and so forth will be debated, and it's likely that, just to answer your question, that Obamacare will not be repealed in a single vote. The scenario that you mentioned will probably occur in that it'll be repealed at a time certain, and then they'll try to figure out how to make it work better. Now, The question is, what kinds of mechanisms? My friend Bill Zeliff talked about his A to Z program that he had, that he proposed back in the early 90s, which was rejected by the Democratic leadership in Congress. However, as painful as it is, it was also rejected by the succeeding Republican. As I recall, Bill, it was hard for you to get Newt Gingrich and the Republicans to do any better than the Democrats had done before. I have my ideas about what can be done to systemically change the character of the debate in Washington. One of my ideas is, which is a lot of people have, is to move to biennial budgets with a money year and a non-money year. Way we should be doing it, by the way, in the New Hampshire legislature, but don't. In that way, you give these committees more time to exercise oversight, like appropriations and the other committees that have jurisdiction over entitlement programs, so that they can spend the time that's necessary to talk to people in all sectors of government and society about what would work best, instead of spending most of the time reactively trying to figure out how to fund government. For the last decade, we haven't completed any of the appropriations, or most of them haven't been completed. We've run essentially on continuing resolutions, and it's a sad story when in fact the only mechanism for fiscal responsibility is a continuing resolution, because it doesn't involve any policy at all.
Including as of yesterday.
And
Right.
so, correct. So these are the kinds of issues we have to figure out. What is the nature of the debate these days, for example, on a constitutional amendment to have a balanced budget, or any of the other issues that have been on the table, and how can we get those debates more to the forefront rather than setting up the Congress with very, very difficult decisions. The emergency spending on defense, on storm-related damage, on all sorts of different items is completely outside of the normal budget process. How do you incorporate that kind of thing? Do you have a set-aside in the budget every year for all of this stuff? Those are the debates that the Budget Committee should be having, but they have to do it in the context where they're not being reactive, because we're already a quarter of the way into the budget year, and we're still trying to figure out how to close out the last one. So those are some thoughts.
You know, we have a couple of Rudman Fellows who are designated questioners here, and I want to get to them real quick before our time runs out. Do you want to have a question?
How do you think Speaker Paul Ryan, a well-known fiscal hawk, will impact President-elect Trump's spending plans, seeing as how the President-elect wants to increase military spending, infrastructure spending, and does not want to reform entitlements?
The relationship between the presumptive president-elect and Speaker Ryan is an interesting one. It has been contentious, testy, fraught with all kinds of political intrigue. Speaker Ryan has to contest with a fractured Republican caucus, where the Freedom Caucus, the Tuesday group, the Monday group, the Friday group, the various components of his caucus are often at odds with each other about whether to shut down the government completely or agree that it can go forward but on a limited basis. So his first problem is dealing with his fractured caucus. Lately, he's been showing an increasing propensity to simply roll over and toe the line. So I think that when it comes, for example, to tax cuts, which in my view are irresponsible, I think that Speaker Ryan and his majority caucus will roll over. I think there is no doubt in my mind, that we're going to see a tax cut, a big tax cut. Now, whether or not Ryan goes along with the full throttle that the presumptive president-elect's plan would present him, which, by the way, would give everybody in the country a tax cut, but significantly enhanced tax cuts for the top 1%. By many percent. It's something like up to the very top 1%. It's about a 1.4% effect on folks. But then for the top 1%, it's a 14% benefit that they get on the tax cuts. And that may be an area where the Republicans and Speaker Ryan have some discussions with the presumptive president-elect about the size and nature of the tax cuts. And maybe they'll be satisfied with a smaller tax cut and declare victory and go home without putting the country through. For example, we've seen this before. We saw it in 2002. You'll recall year 2000, we have a budget surplus. We're headed for various surpluses in 2002. The CBO had to completely revise its projections for deficits and debt based on the tax cut that came in, and that was before the other events that impacted us between 2000 and 2008, ending with the Great Recession. So we've seen what happens when there's a nonsensical tax cut combined with massive increased spending. This is not, it's just, and whether or not Ryan will exercise common sense about this is hard to see. They're not going to want to hamstring the presumptive president-elect too far, but I think there will be some impact that they will have on his current proposal.
Well, let me drill down on that just a little bit, Paul, because one of the issues that was unresolved in the recent campaign is the growing income equality in our country and the concentration of wealth at the top, where for the past 20 years you had the lower half of society basically stagnant in wage growth, and that the upper half of society saw a doubling of income, and then the 1% saw their income increase from about $430,000 a year to $1.3 million a year at the present. And if you do the tax cut that the president-elect has proposed, that would probably come to about a $300,000 tax cut for the 1% and about a $300 tax cut for the people at the bottom. So unless we're able to, I think, resolve this tension of this growing income inequality, I can only see deficits increasing and more and more unsatisfied voters.
But you see a tension that apparently neither the presumptive president-elect nor the speaker see. So, I mean, let's not get too deep into the philosophy. Your point is that the tax cut is irresponsible and it increases income inequality. But that the question is there anything to be done about it? Because they don't care. Not to be partisan about it, but it's just, they don't care. So how do you make them care is a question. I mean, remember, we are also dealing with a master marketer and showman at the helm who will whose supporters don't seem to care about what is actually happening and will believe what he says. So if he says, I've now given you a fabulous tax cut, it's a great tax cut, they're going to believe it. The question for citizens is there a wedge into Speaker Ryan and or members of his caucus to point out ways in which they might be hurt down the line if they do bad things to the federal budget. And remember, every member of Congress cares only about getting elected and reelected. So there's something to be done there.
I think you're going to find that, like a lot of the stuff, there's going to be a balance. And I think
He's such a wise person.
No. But Ways and Means is already talking about major tax reform. And that will be huge.
Good word.
Well, you don't like it? You don't like it?
No, huge is a good word. It's huge.
For example, and things like we are very uncompetitive with our the percentage that we charge corporations overseas.
Absolutely.
35%. Now, we probably, if we got sensible and could come to an agreement to bring that down around 25%, then we're going to find that it will increase business and increase tax revenue. So those kinds of things, I know that the Ways and Means people are. There's a lot of money sitting out overseas with corporate. Give them an 8% to bring it back, and tell them if they don't bring it back, they will find a way that to hold them accountable. So those are the kinds of things that we should be thinking about doing. And I think at the end of the day, even you guys will realize you can't keep spending.
Okay. We have to be mindful of the time here, so I want to give our questioner a chance.
Thank you. So my question is regarding a topic that, as a law student, is always on the back of my mind, and that is student debt. Outstanding student debt is around $1.3 trillion, the vast majority of which is federal student debt. So it's a two-part question. First, is the current system of funding financial higher education, or financing higher education, excuse me, sustainable? And how do you see the next administration handling this issue? And also, how do you think they should handle this issue? Thank you.
Well, I'm happy to address the issue. I think it's very tangentially related to the issue of the Concord Coalition mission. I used to serve on the New Hampshire Higher Education Assistance Foundation board. We did most of the student loans in New Hampshire through New Hampshire institutions and New Hampshire banks, and our default rate was somewhere around 1 or 2%. Now with the direct student loan program, they're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of defaulted loans, which obviously adds to the deficit. The problem of student loans and education is not only the high cost of tuition, but the fact that every time the federal government increases Stafford loans and Pell Grants and so forth, the cost of tuition goes up even more. And even my good friend and perhaps slightly more liberal opponent, Arnie Arneson, recognized that the problem of student debt was both the responsibility of the institutions, education institutions' ability to control costs, as well as it was the government's obligation to provide support.
The landscape is interesting. I mean, the nominee to head the Department of Education is somebody who has little experience, little to no experience in terms of the various mechanisms that the federal government provides help both throughout the educational system. I don't see if she becomes the Secretary of Education. This is Betsy DeVoe that I'm talking about. I think that the future of the federal grant and scholarship system is not very rosy, And I certainly don't see any cuts coming to the rates that students have to pay for loans and various proposals that have been out there to help people afford their loans. I just don't see those programs going anywhere.
George?
Well, I don't have anything more to add to that subject, but I would like to suggest that possibly the discussion about the deficit really runs to perhaps a larger issue, and that is our political system itself. And since the Citizens United case, and opening up the floodgates of corporate money, and from that the introduction of super PACs, dark campaign finances, voter suppression, gerrymandering, the billionaires club of the Koch brothers, the Koch brothers, Sheldon Adelson, and yes, George Soros, with all of those factors working into our political system, what kind of a makeup in Congress are we going to get? We're going to get perhaps folks that are not really interested in mundane matters such as the deficit, but more interested in perhaps helping the people who help them get elected. And I just think we find ourselves at a very sorry state unless we begin getting a handle on this, and perhaps beginning with doing something about Citizens United.
You know, George, you're absolutely right, and I would just say that the three of us who are former members of Congress belong to an effort called Issue 1, which is comprised of former members of Congress, the Senate, and other government positions working on the issue of campaign finance reform. Now, in the presidential election we've just seen, Hillary Clinton talked about campaign finance reform. The presumptive president-elect attracted people by saying, "Well, nobody owns me because I've got all the money in the world, so I don't need anybody. Nobody can buy me," and that may very well be true. But the issue of campaign finance reform is critical to changing things. But you also have to look at the state of our media. During the presidential election, there was not a single question posed to the candidates about the federal budget debts and deficits. It just wasn't discussed. I come back to saying that citizen engagement and civic engagement is more important than ever before. I encourage you all to become avid letter writers, telephone callers. There's nothing like telephone calls to a congressional office to amplify concerns, because every time a single person calls or writes, the staff helps the member calculate what the plus up is. You know, if there's one call, maybe it represents 500 people. So if you all are scared enough and anxious enough and concerned enough to start picking up the phone and writing letters and really weighing in on these issues on a regular basis, it takes sustained commitment. Just the people in this room actually represent a very powerful force for change.
Paul, I'd like to end on that optimistic and challenging note for us, but I think to summarize what I've heard, I mean, there is a serious problem on the fiscal front. It is something that Congress and the new president need to attack on a systemic basis. I think all of our panelists have pointed out that this is not a pinprick thing that you can deal with. There are systemic forces, whether it's the nature of the budget, nature of the political process that we need to deal with, and that these need to be dealt with on a bipartisan basis in efforts that all of our speakers have been involved with before. So the Concord Coalition will continue to be here. I want to thank our Rudman Fellows. I want to thank Margaret Rudman and Jean and Jay Gale for being here and for being so supportive of the Concord Coalition's efforts and the Rudman Center's efforts. And of course, I want to thank Dean Budd for hosting us once again here at the Concord Coalition. And as the year here at the Concord Coalition, here at the Rudman Center, Freudian slip. So anyway, and Chase Hageman, our New England Regional Director. So as we go through these challenging few months on the budget, the Concord Coalition will be here and hope to do more programs and keep this issue front and center. And thank you all for coming today. You're welcome.
Huge.